I guess it's a good time to get into various Canada stuff. I said I wanted to look at some of Avi Lewis's recent media appearances. And I just think, like, going back to the conversation that we had on this program shortly after he won about how that's kind of like a really positive thing about this moment and about what Avi Lewis's role can be right now since he's not in Parliament, is to just kind of like be able to be out there and be a PR guy for the Canadian left right now. And so far, that seems to be working out quite well. He's really good on going on the media. He's very good at staying on message. I saw some lib on Threads say they don't like Avi's tone on power and politics. Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that, like, for people, they're going to have to get used to someone, like, actually expressing some of these ideas, not in, like, well, I'm sorry, but maybe if we just raise taxes a little bit, and not doing this, like, you know, kind of sad, hat in hand, like Jack Lemmon and Glengarry Glen Ross approach to promoting left-wing ideas. It's going to be jarring to people in this country who are not used to seeing this, to someone advocating for basic social democracy, because we live in this completely backwards, reactionary country. But yeah, I get that people are going to have a hard time with that. He was a journalist. He knows when they're trying to pivot the conversation and won't let it happen. And yeah, I think this is just something that's really refreshing to see. If you've been, you know, through this last lost decade, like, we can look at some of these clips of Avi Lewis and just try to imagine Jugmeat doing some of this stuff. And for all the people that want to, you know, and listen, we can talk about the Jugmeat's role as NDP leader for the last decade, and was it good enough? Was it not good enough? Like, what could have been better? And people will say, well, they got these like progressive policies advanced, like dental care, means tested dental care, and we've talked about that. But like, when we watched the Mark Carney forward guidance thing, you'll notice that Mark Carney, in addition to like talking about the austerity that he's doing and cuts that he's doing and drastically increased military spending he's doing, he's also saying, like, we also looked out for Canadians with these big social programs like dental care. You'll notice that Mark Carney did not acknowledge at any point that the NDP was largely responsible for forcing the Liberals' hand on like promoting these kinds of policies, which is kind of evidence about how this method of promoting these kinds of policies is really lacking. Because yeah, okay, it's not lacking in the terms that like it did increase the coverage for certain people that meet this like means test, and it does benefit people. These are good things. But you'll see the NDP gets no credit whatsoever for the role they played in that. And it just gets absorbed into the Liberal Party, and then they go and brag about these policies that the NDP had to force their hand on. I think that in and of itself is an example of like how they need to go way harder. Carney simultaneously takes credit for it and refuses to make progress on it. Yeah, that's what they call it, Marky deals. I loathe Carney more than I already did Harper. Well, I mean, I think that's understandable because, like we've talked about, they basically have the same economic agenda, maybe with a few little differences. Obviously, it's a different moment in Canadian politics right now than it was during the Harper era. But the way that Carney has taken those like deeply conservative economic policy agenda and wrapped it in this like this smiling liberal face and mixed it with this kind of like phony nationalist elbows up campaign, it does make it way more evil. Because like at least Harper, you could look at him and be like, okay, this is guy's just like a evil servant for power. He cares about advancing the interests of the ruling class of this country, you know. But Carney, the way Carney is able to manipulate people and like convince people that like he's not doing those things while doing it just about as effectively as anybody's ever done in this country, it's frustrating. Carney cut even more than Harper, and nobody talks about it. Basically, well, it shows how within this liberal democracy and like the partisan brainworms that people have in the two-party system, where like not only do people not talk about it, they celebrate it. And like a liberal voter can be pro carbon tax. They can be pro carbon tax for years and years and years, despite all these attacks that it's getting from the right. And they say, no, this is an important policy. We need to keep this in place. And then as soon as Mark Carney says, like, I have a great idea, we're going to cut the carbon tax. And all these people say, well done, sir. Good idea. I agree. Why haven't we been doing that? Like, they just believe in nothing whatsoever. They have no actual values or principles whatsoever. As soon as the guy at the top tells them, no, we're actually going to do the exact opposite to what we've been doing. And all these exact same people are like, good, thank you, good job. Don't you want oil companies to be competitive, though? Yes. Jesus Christ. Again, we talk about the people in our media. This is who their bosses are. This is who they're there to protect. The people in the media, the people in the Liberal Party, the people in the Conservative Party. This is their whole job, is to preserve this like economic status quo and make sure those gears are continually turning, no matter what. Yeah, calling it a sovereign wealth fund is literally double speak. I think, like, yeah, if it's Mark fucking Carney talking about this stuff, you need to look beyond the rhetoric that he's using. You can call something a sovereign wealth fund, but that's not what it is. Like, and you should probably doubt that that's what Mark Carney is up to. This is exactly, I think, like what is important about what Avi Lewis is doing right now. Is just being out there, being a spokesperson for these ideas, getting these ideas out there, staying on message. And there's never going to be a better time to get these ideas out when we have this like red Tory uni party that's been created through this backroom dealing. There's never going to be a better time, especially if things continue to get worse. If these price shocks get worse, if it's clear that Carney's there to protect the wealthy and ruling class and billionaire and tax shelter people that are like him and like his friends, and the more people are going to struggle, like that's the absolute best time to be out there promoting these ideas with someone at the head of that movement who has the ability to talk about these things in like plain language and to go on TV and express these ideas in environments where there's a tremendous amount of hostility to these ideas. So we can look at a few things here. Here's Avi Lewis reacting to the 2026 Spring Economic Update.
I think today was the Liberal government had a big opportunity today to actually address the everyday emergency of the crisis of the cost of living for Canadians with concrete measures, new programs that would actually make people's everyday lives better. It didn't do that. And not only that, there wasn't a single new revenue measure in this entire update that would actually introduce new revenue from extremely profitable corporations like the oil and gas sector, which is forecast to make $90 billion of excess wartime profits this year alone. We should have seen a windfall tax, and we called for one. And so there was a lot of revenue left on the table. The measures that the government has introduced, the grocery and essentials benefit is one that we support. We think it should be more, but it is something that we support. On the other hand, the gas tax holiday or the gas tax reduction, the middle class, so-called middle class tax cut, these are extremely expensive measures that cost billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year, and they do not fundamentally change the equation for Canadians who are struggling to put food on the table for their kids. Price of gas is already back up to $1.80 a litre in Toronto on average today, so that gas tax cut, which cost more than $2 billion a year, already gone, evaporated, swallowed up by price gouging corporations.
On the notion that there's no increased government revenue from the oil and gas sector, it's not entirely true, because by including EOR, enhanced oil recovery, into carbon captures...
I would call that a new subsidy for the oil and gas industry, which was demanded by Alberta as part of the MOU with the Liberal government. This was, the whole notion of carbon capture and storage. It's supposed to be the big climate solution that's going to negate the carbon impact of extracting all the oil and gas in Canada. Instead, the industry traditionally uses it to get more oil and gas out of the ground, and the Liberal government just open that up for Alberta. That's a subsidy to oil and gas.
There's no carbon capture.
Can I actually hear from Ms. McPherson on that?
That's one thing. It's one thing we need to talk about too. This whole idea of like when we talk about climate and like that's like the thing that you say. It's like two-state solution. It's just saying I don't want to talk about this issue. Carbon capture. Yes, it's called a tree. There's a magical thing that captures carbon from there. It is called a tree. It's called a forest. Can capture my carbon easily. You guys just need more practice. Just go into the back of your car with a plastic bag. My whole apartment's filled with carbon. balloons full of fucking car exhaust all throughout your apartment. Okay.
That up for Alberta. That's a subsidy to oil and gas, not a new revenue measure. There are other measures in those legislative changes, like changes to the Canada Food Inspection Agency, that are posited as positive changes from a government that just, through its cuts to public spending, laid off 600 food inspectors at the very same time that we've just seen Loblaws and Sobeys underweighing and overcharging for meat, again, a year after the CBC revealed that this was a common practice. So there's a lot of mixed messages here, and there isn't a singular focus on working class people who are not invited to the bankers' banquet of all of the private sector forecasters who appear at the very beginning of the document in a much larger font as the bedrock of whom the Prime Minister clearly considers his real constituency. I think a sizable investment in skilled trade apprenticeships seems like an excellent thing. The devil is really going to be in the implementation, and we've got to see trade unions involved in how those programs are rolled out. First of all, I already saw one commentator today say that in the year 2024, there were almost 50,000 young people enrolled in skilled trade apprenticeships in Canada. So maybe 100,000 by 5 years from now is not the giant number that the sticker shock number that they're hoping. But more importantly, it is very poignant today, on the National Day of Mourning for workers killed, injured, and made ill on the job, that we don't see labor at the table or workers' issues really addressed in this economic update.
Can you vote for this update?
Well, we're going to have a caucus meeting tomorrow, and we make those decisions about how we vote as a caucus. So we're going to study everything carefully.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
it might be better suited for your colleague, Ms. Gazan, but in the economic statement, there's $8 million for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Is that enough in the view of the NDP?
Yeah, I'm going to talk to Leah Gazan, our critic, about that. It seems like a very small amount compared to the large numbers that were announced a few years ago. And we're trying to determine whether that is a giant cut, which is what it looks like, or whether we just have to dig into those numbers and find out. But it's a disturbingly small number.
It's a disturbingly small number. And again, it's being coupled with giving the police vast new powers in this country. And participating and contributing to the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples is like the prime job of the police in this nation. And I'm always just struck by this too, the fact that like we had to put together a report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And this is a country that loves to accuse other countries of human rights violations and using human rights as this weapon to justify regime change operations or bombings for the United States, even when it's the United States led by Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth, who are literally threatening us as a country, and we still contribute to that and we still support them because of human rights or women's rights. We talk about women's rights in Iran or Afghanistan or wherever. And we use that to justify all kinds of things. And we literally have something in this country called the Report on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which, as they're pointing out, is being like drastically underfunded. And to my knowledge, I don't know if we've acted on anything whatsoever that was actually in this report that was actionable. And my distinct memory of that moment when that report was released was not a sense of national shock and outrage and disgust, which is what should have happened in a normal country when you realize there's an epidemic of Indigenous women and girls being disappeared and murdered. A normal country would react in shock and revulsion to that information. In this country, though, what I remember happening is we had about a week-long discourse about the word genocide and whether we're continuing to use the word genocide or an ongoing genocide to describe the state's relationship with Indigenous people was appropriate, or whether it was actually offensive to victims of actual genocides. We talked about that for about a week and a half, and then we fucking dropped it. And now, years later, we're talking about, oh, well, maybe we'll release some funds for looking into this issue a bit more and drastically underfunding this actual program. The media was platforming right-wing anti-Indigenous conspiracy theorists and continues to. And we've talked about in like BC how that's becoming like a major political force. People that are directly organizing around anti-Indigenous racism in this country. It's shocking, or it should be shocking. Again, if we lived in a normal country, that would be shocking and that would be unacceptable. We're citing the Norway example. We're citing the Norway example, but really this sovereign wealth fund is to fund private resource extraction projects.
Are you at all considering running in Beaches East York when there's a by-election there?
Well, Mark, I didn't see anything in the spring economic update about that precise question, but it's possible there was an annex that I missed. No, I've already ruled out running in that by-election in Beaches East York. Yes, yeah. Okay. As I've said, there's plenty of work to do for me across the country, rebuilding the party, and I'm going to prioritize that.
I think this is smart.
Are you concerned about the...
I think this is, first of all, like shutting down that kind of question is funny. But yeah, I think it's smart to not jump into... AVI doesn't need to be in Parliament right now. And one of the things that would be a fucking disaster right now and would like really hamper their ability to make any progress whatsoever right now is for him to jump into a by-election and not win. That would be a huge disaster right off the bat. I think what Avi's doing is right now is what he should be doing, which is traveling the country, talking to people, organizing, going on TV and talking about this stuff and building support for this movement and this party and these ideas. It makes sense that anti-Indigenous racism is returning to a more open phase as the Canadian state returns to a more open phase of resource colonialism. Yeah, I agree that it does make sense on that kind of logical basis. I guess the thing that what frustrates me and makes me really angry about this country is our obsession with pretending that we're beyond these things and we're above these things. Like, I would love for Canada to just admit, if that's what this country is, which it is, as we know, I think we should just be open and honest about that rather than pretending we have this like moral high ground to talk about human rights or women's rights or genocide or whatever it is. Like, I just think we should just fuck off with that. And that's what I really can't stand. I mean, the violence and the genocide is obviously a horrifying crime. But kind of secondary to that is this insistence that people in this country have on pretending that it's not happening or pretending that we're above these things. That just really makes me feel insane. Pretending we're above it, and then also, like I was saying, using it as a cudgel to go after other countries that are targets of imperialism, that are outside of the empire that we're part of. The Canadian Parliament coming together in a bipartisan basis to declare a genocide in Xinjiang in light of all the things happening in this country is pathetic. It's deeply pathetic. The most undeserved sense of moral superiority maybe ever in history. And just, this is the funny thing too, is it's just like no one around the world, we have this idea of like the world or the Western world, right? And the world agrees about this. When the actual world, all the countries that are not Canada, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, a few others, the vast majority of the world recognizes that we're always up to our same bullshit that we've been up to for centuries. No one believes it. It doesn't know it's for nobody. No one believes this. It's just for their own, it's to huff their own farts, basically. It's to have this sense of like moral or political superiority, which is entirely unearned. We're proud to sew the flag on our backpack. That's right. We shouldn't be. A more polite and orderly colonialism is basically all that distinguished what would become Canada from the United States as they competed for the western half of the continent. You're right. And we're talking about that commercial. And what does he say? I believe in peacekeeping, not policing. It's in the commercial. You know, the commercial that invented our entire culture, Canadian culture, which is entirely defined by not being American, which was spelled out explicitly in that stupid fucking commercial. I believe in peacekeeping, not policing.
What do you make of that in terms of these program standings with this current government? I mean,
there is one mention of the word pharmacare in this entire document. And the reality is that in the last days and weeks, we've heard from Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and I believe we will shortly hear from Nova Scotia, that the federal government is refusing to fund the quote-unquote national pharmacare program that Heather and Dawn and the rest of our caucus won.
Which Carney's bragging about. Like we were talking about, he's simultaneously bragging about pharmacare, not mentioning the fact that it was the NDP that forced the Liberals' hand on this, which again is I think a real evidence in the way that like this kind of like minority government deal making can prop up the Liberals while actually not really benefiting the party doing the propping up in any meaningful way, even if we want to acknowledge the ways that, you know, maybe the average person might benefit from this. But he wants to brag about it. Carney wants to brag about it while simultaneously not acknowledging the NDP played that role and also not funding it.
It is shameful. The Carney government committed to fulfilling that program. You should not have to live in an NDP province like Manitoba or British Columbia, who are among the first to sign the pharmacare agreements with the federal government, in order to get that fundamental benefit. We should have pharmacare for all. We've been fighting for that for generations. The Liberals have been promising it since 1993. And we still don't have it, even though we won it. And that tells you everything you need to know about the priorities of this government. This government is creating a fund with tens of billions of dollars of public money to benefit these massive private projects that will make huge profits for already profitable corporations. We should be investing that kind of money in the economy of care, where Canadians work and actually take care of each other, that binds our society together. We don't see pharmacare. We don't see increased investments in healthcare. We don't see the other main demand that we made of the Prime Minister to enforce the Canada Health Act and stop the rampant privatization of healthcare in Canada. This government does not have the priorities of working class Canadians at heart. Thanks, everybody.
I mean, he's good at this, man. We're gonna look at some more clips, but he's good at this. And like, you know, when I joined the NDP in, I think, 2017 to vote for Nikki Ashton after the whole Bernie campaign had happened, and it's like, oh, this is what we need to do here. You know, if we had gotten a leader like that at that time, I would have been thrilled. You know, if the NDP had had a leader doing what AVI's doing right now 10 years ago, perhaps the NDP would be in a better position today. But I would have been thrilled. I'm maybe a little bit more bitter and cynical now about everything and about the possibilities of organizing within this system and what's possible and what's not possible. But it's undeniable, I think, that he is good at this and getting these messages out there.
Welcome back to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capels coming to you live from Parliament Hill, just below the House of Commons by Avi Lewis, the newish leader, I should say, of the federal NDP. Hi, Mr. Lewis. It's good to see you. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you in person.
Yeah, thanks for making the time. To the subject of the economic update. Now, I've listened as closely as I can in between doing those interviews to your initial comments, read through your statement. If I understand it correctly, and do correct me if I'm wrong, your primary critique is that they could have done more, particularly on the revenue side.
Yeah, I mean, there's no new revenue measures in this budget. In a time of deficit, in a time of a grinding cost of living emergency for working class Canadians, we needed to see some concrete measures that would actually improve people's daily lives. And instead, we've got long-term stuff. I think the apprenticeships are good if they're implemented well, and the provinces can't just take that money. There got to be strings on that money. A lot of re-announcements of previous announcements, a middle-class tax cut, quote-unquote, and a gas tax cut, which have already been swallowed up by the cost of living emergency. Gas today is $1.80 in Toronto on average. Where is that $2.5 billion gone? We need more revenue to support people in this cost of living crisis. We have oil and gas companies making $90 billion in excess wartime profits this year alone, projected, and banks that made $70 billion last year. Where are the excess profit taxes on some of those profitable corporations in Canada at a time when we need the revenue to actually make people's lives more affordable?
How do you know those excess profit taxes, would work from like a management government perspective? Because there are examples in Europe and the UK where it's been an entirely bumpy road. The revenues were not nearly what they were forecast to be. And B, how do you know that that would be passed on to the consumer? Because we have other examples in this country where, you know, things have been done and not passed on to the consumer.
When you have taxes on profitable corporations, like Chrystia Freeland put a 15% windfall profit tax on banks during the pandemic. That money came into public revenue, and it was available for programs like the National Pharmacare Program, which the Liberals promised to extend to all provinces. We've heard recently in the last days and weeks from PEI, from Newfoundland, and shortly from Nova Scotia, that this Liberal government is refusing to extend pharmacare, which we won, as you remember, in the Supply and Confidence Agreement. Canadians are paying more and more for medications. Canadians are paying more and more for healthcare because there's privatization under Bill 11 in Alberta. Here in Ontario, you can pay $4,300 a year for a private family doctor, and there are more copays. Refugee applicants are getting cut off of health benefits and having to pay more. Canadians are paying more for the fundamental public program that we rely on as Canadians, our healthcare system. They should enforce the Canada Health Act. They should extend the pharmacare benefit to everyone the way they said they would. And instead, they're seeding a sovereign wealth mechanism, which is going to be a public subsidy to profitable corporations for big projects. So the priorities are wrong.
But from what I garnered again from what you've released so far, you know, you think that, for example, that sovereign wealth fund should be modeled after the Norwegian example.
Actually, the Prime Minister cited the Norwegian example.
He cited it, but you also said that works really well.
He's doing the opposite.
But the preconditions for that are different than in Canada,
Fair,
right? Norway has stakes, Norway has an ownership stake in its oil companies and therefore can take.
Norway is able to do that because it has an ownership stake in these oil companies. If only there was some, my brain is making a connection here. If only that there was something we could do to make it more like that model. But it's funny to say like, oh, Avi, you're saying it should be more like the Norwegian model when it's fucking Mark Carney himself that's deliberately misleading people by using this kind of reference to describe something which is nothing like the actual model. Yeah, it was so close to getting it. Norway is able to do that because they own these oil companies. Huh. You don't say. What a concept. Imagine that, the actual state having an ownership stake in the resource extraction industry in the country where everyone has to live. That's crazy. Those crazy Norwegians.
Norway has an ownership stake in its oil companies and therefore can take revenues and put them in there, invest them in global markets and see that grow and then, pass those on to people who live in that country.
In the minority government of 1972, my grandfather, David Lewis, then leader of the federal NDP, won Petrocan, a publicly owned national oil and gas company for Canada. If it hadn't been privatized by conservative and liberal governments, we would have had a national oil company, and we could have used some of
You lead a party that fought against government ownership of TMX. How do we reconcile that?
That the only thing the liberals could think of to nationalize was a bitumen pipeline, when there are many more benefits for the public in having something like a public oil company, which could model a just transition and not throw workers under the bus the way the industry itself is doing today.
But slightly different from having a state-owned oil company and putting up public funds to fund this pipeline that no one actually wanted. No one in the communities, and that was like politically unpopular elsewhere. And a slightly different kind of situation.
Model. But more importantly, while we're talking about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, there are differences, obviously, between us and Norway. But it is striking how opposite model that Carney is pursuing is to the one that he's citing. In Norway, they appropriately taxed a finite resource over generations. They built a huge sovereign wealth fund of $2.2 trillion now. They have a rock-solid social safety net. They have almost every new vehicle bought in Norway is an EV. They're making a transition beyond oil and gas, at least domestically. In Canada, we let American companies, still 60% of our oil industry is owned by Americans, and we've been sending, now it's 90% instead of 97% of our oil straight to the United States, and generational wealth has been sucked out of the ground in Canada for foreign corporations, and we've got nothing to show for it. Now, we're creating a sovereign wealth fund where we're putting public money in, which will subsidize private sector projects. It is the opposite of the Norwegian example. And I think that if that money in the sovereign wealth fund actually goes to fund an oil pipeline to British Columbia, it'll be really striking what this whole thing was about.
To be clear, though, like, oil companies are taxed. The way in which you present it as though they just operate freely here, take all the benefits.
Sure.
Again, the way he handled that answer was really good. And dealing with Canadian journalists whose job it is to grease the skids for the resource extraction industry that owns this country. That the entire political system, it basically exists to ensure that this process continues. And then you have people in the Canadian media, both on the CBC and outside, and more private in CTV and these other places. It is their job to ensure that system remains in place. And then anyone that challenges that remotely faces this kind of intense scrutiny. So that was a good way to answer that question.
The reason that there's any additional revenue right now is because of higher income tax revenues for the government. Like, those companies are taxed on a proportionate basis.
I never said they weren't taxed. Absolutely, they are taxed. But I think when you have something like an illegal, reprehensible attack and a war in the Middle East, the most volatile region in the world, by this completely unpredictable force to the south of us, and by Israel, which is still committing genocide in Gaza, and you have a global instability.
Put that in there on your CTV interview as well.
And you have a global instability, energy shock that the head of the International Energy Agency has said the worst in history. Oil companies in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere are making wartime massive inflated profits. Some portion of those windfall profits should be returned to protect us from the inflation spiral, from the cost spikes that are coming as a result of that war.
I understand
That's just
the
made sense.
principle of that argument, but
the
right
art
now
of government is to turn that into practice.
We have an industry saying that even the level of taxation being proposed, for example, through an increase to the industrial carbon.
No shit, the industry is saying that. Who cares? Yeah, they're going to say, guess what people in the oil and gas industry are going to say? We're already taxed too much. Yeah, we get it. We're supposed to take with anything that they say with as being like a serious diagnosis of anything. But people in the industry say that they're already being taxed. And again, we go back to that power and politics thing with David Cochrane. We look at this interview and look at the way that these people act as spokespeople, not for the media organization, not for the Canadian government, but for the oil and gas industry. Those are their bosses. Those are their bosses. Those are who are calling the shots. And every single person in this position in Canadian media, that's what their job is. to be a front man or a PR person for this industry. And if you understand that, you understand why these interviews play out like this. Anyway, this is Avi's answer here was what was getting a lot of attention online, and I think that's deserved.
We have an industry saying that even the level of taxation being proposed, for example, through an increase to the industrial carbon price, would put them at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, you still want the tax revenue from those companies. What happens if what you put in place deflates them and makes them uncompetitive?
Tell the family where 1 in 4 Canadians is skipping a meal or reducing the size of their portions in order to feed their kids, that an industry making $90 billion in windfall profits this year can't afford to pay a little bit more. I'm sorry, I just don't accept it.
Is it just a little bit more? Is that, I mean, because again,
hell yeah, man. I'm like, I love to hear that. I really do. And again, just like, I don't even mean to Jagmeet Singh. I think he seemed like a very nice man. I think he had some strong values, progressive values. I appreciate the guy. I've complained a lot about the guy, and I didn't know that he was like the right person to be in that position in that like unique historical moment. So I'm not trying to be mean to Jagmeet Singh, but like just trying to imagine him like answering a question like that. And there's probably a race aspect to that as well. If Jagmeet Singh is going to get maybe a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more forceful, then all of a sudden that opens up this kind of different angle and a different aspect of criticism. That's probably an element as well. But I can't imagine him for any reason, like responding to a question like that. And just this basic idea. Yeah, I just don't accept it. Like we're still being asked to like feel so bad for these companies. What they're going to be taxed too much. They're not going to be competitive with the massive amount of money that these companies are raking in day after day at the expense of everyone else. And we're supposed to be satisfied with like, oh, they're being taxed slightly. And the way that he can respond like that I think this is what the people that supported Avi's campaign and wanted him to be in this position, this is why, for these exact moments. And he's showing, I think, that he can do that. He can pull that off very effectively. We're being told to go hungry to subsidize record profits. Yeah, and like this is the thing that I think from this angle is so important to talk about. The way that like you see the massive increase in corporate profits starting in the neoliberal era, when taxes were lowered so drastically, and how this directly coincides to all these like increasing like social crises and poverty and hunger and like all these like downstream consequences and people's debt, people's inability to get ahead. You see there's this direct relationship between this massive rise in corporate profits and everyone else's quality of life taking a nosedive. And we can't even talk about taxing them even more. Oh, they're going to be taxed. Oh, no. And again, I just think that's what I'm trying to point out. People like in this media establishment in this country, that is who they report to. That is their role. Those are their bosses.
I'm sorry, I just don't accept it.
Is it just a little bit more? Is that, I mean, because again, what
no,
they're saying
let's
is
tax
the
wealth in Canada. A 1% tax on wealth of 25, 50, $100 million or more. 1, 2, 3% tax could generate $40 billion a year in revenue. Are you saying that people who are worth $10 million can't pay 1% more tax? That would create tens of billions of dollars of public revenue to support people in a cost of living crisis?
I think what I wonder, and I remember when there were some proponents in the previous government of doing the same, is if Canadians, in theory, would understand that, would say, great, that sounds like
that's your job.
Massively popular policy.
Yeah, exactly. In public opinion polling.
Maybe the Canadian public would understand it if we had a media establishment that was interested in fucking talking about these issues. Like, Canadians just wouldn't get it. Like, why is that though? Why is that? Why is it that Canadians would have such a hard time understanding that actually taxing the most wealthy and most powerful people in this country and these massive like industries that control all of the resources in this nation, that actually wouldn't be that bad of a thing and would actually benefit everyone else tremendously? Why don't they understand that? Well, gee, I wonder. Yeah, now we'll do the capital flight argument. And as we've talked about before, when it gets into this like capital flight argument, go, leave, okay, goodbye. Okay.
Do they trust the government to implement it in a way, to use those revenues in a way that actually betters their life? And I know you're now leader of the party, but the previous leader was the reason that that party, that government was in power for as long as it was.
Well, I would say that I'm not going to question the basic mechanism of should government do good for people. I think that's what it's for. And obviously the specifics
But shouldn't
of the
we question
programs,
whether it does?
Well, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think you know what it is, and I think it's a point my dad made and my grandfather made too, and a lot of Canadians still agree with, is that this is a wealthy country. And some people are doing incredibly well. In fact, the 1% have never done better. We have the richest of the rich making untold fortunes that they don't even need, and people are really struggling.
Only the
Transit
people are
is
poor.
a mess. Housing is unaffordable. Groceries are off the charts. The point of government is to step up and govern when the market fails to deliver what people need for a price they can actually afford. People are working really hard, Vashi. You know that people are working, they're taking extra jobs, and they can't make it make sense. And if the government, with all of its power, can't actually reapportion the wealth of this country behind the things that would make people's lives more affordable, then what is the government for? Today was an opportunity for them to do something like that. We offered a modest proposal of $300 million a year for a chain of 50 public grocery stores that would cut the cost of groceries for Canadians 30 to 45%. $300 million.
Can you treat execution as an afterthought is my question. Do I trust the government to run a grocery store in a way that will actually make it cheaper for me?
All I hear when you
can't
ask me
treat
the question is, we shouldn't do anything, we shouldn't try anything, because what if it doesn't work?
No, not at all. But,
we're in a crisis,
but I've
Vashi.
covered
No, but
government
yes.
for 10 years where things didn't work, and I have to be.
You know who's really good at doing things and making sure things work? The private sector, who do everything. That's why everyone's so happy with their grocery prices and with housing and with the telecom company and with energy prices. That's why people in this country are just so thrilled, because the private sector is doing such a fucking great job at making sure all these things are delivered to people in a way that like doesn't destroy them financially. What, the government's going to do something? How do we know it wouldn't be inefficient? What's happening right now? That's the question. What is happening right now at this very moment when the private sector does all these things and everyone's miserable? Why aren't we talking about their efficiency? God damn.
I want the stuff to work.
So are you asking this government if it can really spend $500 billion on the military to make Canada a major arms exporter and increase our arms exports by 50%?
I've asked it 100 times. I also covered the procurement boondoggle over the last 20 years. Right?
Great.
Again, execution is an issue.
Execution is an issue, but I don't think it's a reason not to try anything new. And I think in a crisis, we need to get out of the box and actually look at solutions that benefit working class Canadians.
Fair point. You brought me right to the end of our program.
There
I
you go.
appreciate you making the time, Mr. Lewis.
What a
pleasure to see you in person.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's the leader of the NDP, Avi Lewis.
See, like, and the way he's able to take this stuff though, and you know, come across as genuine and friendly, and not lose their temper like I probably would. I probably would have had an aneurysm just being in that position. He's good at this shit, man. And the caveat that we always have to go back to for whatever reason, we can complain about this, or he's not radical enough on this, or we need to be doing more here. Sure. Okay. Yes, I agree. Or electoral politics is inadequate. Sure. Yeah, I agree. Okay. Considering that like we don't have a whole lot going on right now, this seems to be a positive step though. And this is the exact reason why people wanted Avi to be in this position. So we could do interviews just like this. And it's way more valuable to the movement or whatever for him to be out there going on TV and doing this and just like going across the country and having these conversations than parachuting into some community to run for parliament and not winning, which would be an absolute calamity. Every single problem with government-run industry or program comes down to intentional underfunding by fiscal conservatives that want to privatize. Yeah, and this is exactly like what whole neoliberal era has been about, right? Like underfunding these valuable public services and then going out there and being like, look how inefficient the government is at doing these things. Like people complain about the post office or like the driver's license place. Yeah, I'm sure if the private sector was doing a driver's license place, it would really be a lot better. And it's like, yeah, when you have this service that people need and it's drastically underfunded and you don't have enough locations and you don't have enough people working there, it's annoying. And you go and you have to wait in lines to do the basic thing that you're trying to do. The key is to expand this service elsewhere to make it work better. Not to be like, well, look, it's broken and we can never fix it, so just get the private sector in here. Yeah, no shit, there's wait times in hospitals. Of course there are, by design.